Pretend you're my husband for one night, she pleaded. The Alpha King said, She's my Luna. Hello, everyone. On the coldest night Silverpine Ridge had seen in years, Clara Whitmore ran through the rain, wearing a wedding dress meant for a marriage she had never chosen. One sleeve was torn, mud darkened the hem, and beneath the lace around her wrist, 5 bruises marked the shape of a man's hand. Before we follow her into the storm, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps this channel grow and brings more stories of courage, justice, and destiny to life. Clara did not look back at the Whitmore estate. She could still hear her Uncle Preston's final warning as the servants fastened pearl buttons down her spine. At sunrise, you will marry Grant Holloway. By noon, this foolish resistance will be forgotten. Forgotten, as though her fear were a childish mood. As though her father's land, her future, and even her body were possessions to be transferred with a signature. Grant had stood beside the fireplace in his wine-red coat, smiling as if the matter were already settled. He was 35, broad-shouldered, admired by men who confused cruelty with strength. When Clara told him she would never consent, he had closed one hand around her wrist and whispered, An Omega without a wolf does not get to refuse an Alpha. She had waited until the household gathered for supper. Then Naomi Pierce, her oldest friend, left the kitchen door unlatched. Clara fled with nothing but a gray cloak, her mother's silver hairpin, and the small leather pouch containing the last letter her father had written before his death. Rain erased the road behind her, but it could not silence the bells ringing from the estate. Preston had discovered her escape. By the time Clara reached the Lantern's Rest, a lonely and near the northern road, her lungs burned and her shoes were full of icy water. Warm light spilled through warped windows. Inside, travelers bent over bowls of stew while a fire cracked beneath a blackened stone chimney. Clara stepped across the threshold, and every conversation weakened into silence. They saw the ruined dress. They saw the bruises. Most looked away. She had learned long ago that discomfort often disguised itself as indifference. The innkeeper opened his mouth, perhaps to ask questions, when horses thundered outside. Clara's heart lurched. Through the rain-streaked window, she recognized Grant's riders by their burgundy cloaks. 4 men dismounted beneath the swinging lantern. One wore a silver ring stamped with a crown and wolf's head. The mark Preston claimed gave them royal authority to retrieve her. There was no rear exit. No room upstairs she could reach before they entered. Clara searched the common room for mercy and found lowered eyes, nervous hands, strangers already deciding that helping her would cost too much. Then she saw the man sitting alone in the darkest corner. He appeared to be a traveler, though nothing about him felt ordinary. He was tall even while seated, dressed in a rain-darkened coat with no crest or visible weapon. Black hair brushed his collar. A narrow scar crossed his right eyebrow, and his silver-gray eyes rested on the inn door with unsettling calm. He had noticed the riders before anyone else. More than that, he was watching them as though he had expected men like these to come. Clara did not know his name. She did not know why a simple traveler carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. She knew only that Grant's boots had reached the porch. The door shook beneath his fist. Clara Whitmore, he called. Come out before you embarrass yourself further. Her body remembered his grip. For one terrible second, she was back beside the fireplace, trapped between Preston's cold approval and Grant's possessive smile. Then the stranger rose. He made no dramatic gesture. He merely stood, and the room seemed to draw a quieter breath around him. Clara crossed the distance before fear could stop her. Up close, she saw a rain on his collar and an old cut across one knuckle. His expression remained guarded, but not unkind. Sir, she whispered. The pounding came again. Wood splintered near the lock. Clara reached for the stranger's hand, then hesitated, ashamed of asking another person to enter the ruin of her life. His gaze dropped to the bruises beneath her lace cuff. Something cold and dangerous passed through his eyes, disappearing so quickly she wondered whether she had imagined it. What do you need? He asked. The door began to open. Clara tightened her fingers around his hand and forced the words through her trembling breath. Pretend you're my husband for one night. For the first time, the stranger looked surprised. Then his warm hand closed around hers, steady and certain, as Grant Holloway stepped into the inn. Grant Holloway crossed the threshold with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. Rain dripped from his crimson cloak onto the worn wooden floor as three followers spread through the common room, their eyes sweeping over every frightened face. "There you are," Grant said, his smile carrying no warmth. "You've made this far more difficult than necessary." Clara's pulse hammered, but before she could retreat, the stranger stepped forward until he stood between her and the approaching Alpha. His posture remained relaxed, almost casual, yet something about the quiet certainty in his stance caused even Grant's men to hesitate. "My wife has no wish to leave," he said evenly. The single sentence settled over the room like fresh snow. Clara almost forgot to breathe. Grant's expression hardened. "Your wife?" His gaze traveled over the stranger's plain coat with open contempt. "I know every family within 3 territories. I've never seen you." "That doesn't mean you know everyone worth knowing," the traveler replied. His voice never rose, forcing Grant to lean closer instead of overpowering him. The exchange shifted the balance of the room without anyone fully understanding why. Clara caught several patrons exchanging uncertain glances. Men accustomed to authority rarely spoke so calmly when threatened. Stranger still, this traveler answered challenges the way seasoned leaders answered counsels, not by raising his voice, but by making everyone else lower theirs. She found herself wondering, if only for a heartbeat, what kind of life had taught him such effortless command. Grant circled them slowly, studying Clara's face before reaching toward her wrist. "Come here." She instinctively stepped closer to the stranger instead. His hand found hers again, firm but gentle, and without thinking she intertwined her fingers with his. The movement appeared effortless, as though they had done it countless times before. Grant noticed. His jaw tightened. "You expect me to believe she married a drifter?" "Believe whatever lets you sleep," the stranger answered. "But forcing a married woman into another union would invite questions your pack may not welcome." A flicker crossed Grant's features. It vanished quickly, yet Clara saw it. He cared about appearances more than truth. Preston always had. Their schemes depended upon people remaining silent. "Show me proof," Grant demanded. "Names, witnesses, documents." The stranger regarded him without urgency. A marriage does not become less real because strangers were absent. Grant laughed, though the sound lacked conviction. "You speak like someone familiar with pack law." I listened carefully. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. One rider hurried inside, whispering into Grant's ear. Clara caught only fragments. "Search, roads, no witnesses." Grant dismissed him with an irritated wave before turning back. "Very well," he said. "Enjoy your evening together. Tomorrow the council will verify this convenient marriage. If your story survives until then, perhaps I'll offer congratulations." He leaned close enough for Clara alone to hear. "If not, your uncle will personally watch you kneel before everyone." The threat lingered after he walked away. Moments later the riders disappeared into the rain, leaving behind only muddy footprints and uneasy silence. The inn slowly returned to life, though conversations remained hushed. Clara released the stranger's hand, as though waking from a dream. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You didn't deserve to be dragged into this." "Perhaps," he replied. "Or perhaps I was already walking towards something I needed to find." She searched his face, uncertain whether he was speaking about her or something else entirely. The innkeeper approached with visible relief, offering them a private room upstairs before curious ears gathered again. Once the door closed behind them, Clara finally allowed herself to sit. Exhaustion settled into her bones. The stranger removed his damp gloves with measured movements. Across his knuckles, she noticed faint old scars, the kind earned through years of discipline rather than bar fights. "My name is Everett," he said at last. "Everett Blackwell." Clara Whitmore. Saying her own name suddenly felt strange, as if the woman who had fled the estate belonged to another lifetime. Everett glanced toward the narrow window overlooking the road. "Tomorrow won't be about proving a marriage," he said quietly. "Your uncle and Grant are protecting something far more valuable." Clara frowned. "How could you possibly know that?" Instead of answering, Everett reached into his coat and placed a small silver ring on the table. It bore the same crowned wolf emblem worn by Grant's riders, but unlike theirs, this one was scratched deeply across its face. Clara stared at it in confusion, while Everett's eyes remained fixed on the storm outside. "Because," he murmured, "I've seen that symbol used for the wrong reasons before. And tomorrow, I intend to learn who gave them the courage to wear it. Clara lowered herself into the chair across from Everett, but her attention never drifted far from the scarred silver ring resting between them. It looked almost identical to the one worn by Grant's riders, except someone had deliberately carved a deep line through the crowned wolf. You still haven't told me what it means, she said softly. Everett turned the ring once beneath his fingertips before slipping it back into his pocket. Only that the men following you are carrying authority they shouldn't possess. His answer was measured, revealing enough to deepen her concern without satisfying it. Clara studied him in silence. Every instinct told her he was hiding far more than his name, yet nothing about him felt deceptive in the way Preston's polished smiles always had. His secrets seemed protective rather than self-serving. Tomorrow, Everett continued, they'll expect fear. Don't give it to them. Clara let out a weary laugh. You make that sound simple. No, he replied. Just necessary. A gentle knock interrupted them. Naomi Pierce stepped inside, rainwater still glistening across her cloak. Relief flooded her face the moment she saw Clara unharmed, but curiosity quickly followed as she noticed Everett standing nearby. I came as soon as I heard where you were hiding, Naomi whispered before embracing her friend. Half the town believes Grant already dragged you home. Clara introduced Everett only as the man who had saved her from being taken. Naomi thanked him sincerely, though her observant eyes lingered on him longer than most people would have dared. She noticed details others overlooked, the disciplined posture, the careful way he watched every entrance, and the quiet confidence that never slipped into arrogance. Once the innkeeper confirmed no strangers were listening outside the room, Clara finally explained everything she had hidden for months. After her father's death, Preston became her legal guardian and steadily isolated her from anyone who questioned his decisions. He insisted the family's Silverwood forest carried debts too large to repay unless she married Grant. Every document she had been allowed to read supported that claim. Naomi slowly shook her head. Because he never let you see the originals. Clara stared at her. Naomi reached inside her satchel and unfolded a faded survey map bearing the Whitmore seal. Your father asked Evelyn Mercer to preserve several estate records before he died. Evelyn believes Preston altered more than one ledger. Everett stepped closer, examining the markings without touching the paper. His expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. Where is Evelyn now? Still working at the old caretaker's cottage beyond the eastern grove, Naomi answered. She refused to leave even after Preston dismissed her. Everett nodded thoughtfully. Then we need to speak with her before tomorrow night. Clara frowned. Tomorrow night? Grant wasn't bluffing, Everett explained. The council gathering gives them exactly what they want, a public stage. If they can discredit you there, no one will question what follows. The weight of his words settled heavily across the room. Clara had spent weeks believing she only needed to escape a forced marriage. Now she realized something larger had been unfolding long before she ever ran into the storm. She looked toward the letter from her father, still tucked safely inside her leather pouch. He kept telling me never to surrender the forest, she murmured. I thought he meant sentiment. Perhaps, Everett said quietly, he meant responsibility. The room fell silent until Naomi glanced toward Everett again. You speak as though you've stood before councils yourself. A faint smile touched his face without answering the question. Instead, he moved toward the window, where dawn's first pale light began dissolving the darkness beyond the rain. Riders were already moving along the distant road toward Silverpine Ridge. We don't have much time, he said. Before we face anyone else, there's something I need from you, Clara. She met his steady gaze. Anything. No more half-truths, Everett replied. Tell me everything your father ever said about the Silverwood forest, even the parts that never seemed important. I have a feeling the future they're trying to steal began with words spoken long before either of us arrived at this inn. Clara held the worn letter in both hands before carefully unfolding its weathered edges. Her father's handwriting remained steady despite the years that had passed. Most of the message spoke of kindness, restraint, and the duty of protecting those with less power, but one passage drew Everett's full attention. Asterisk, if anyone ever demands the Silverwood without honoring our family, they are not seeking timber. They are seeking what the forest hides. Asterisk. Clara looked up slowly. I always believed he was speaking in riddles. Everett studied the page for another quiet moment. Men like Preston don't risk everything over trees alone. Naomi spread the faded survey map across the table beside the letter. Several worn markings pointed toward forgotten trails deep inside the silverwood, paths no longer shown on any recent records. Evelyn once told me your father ordered these routes removed from official maps, Naomi recalled. He said some places stayed safest when the wrong people forgot they existed. Everett followed one of the hidden trails with his eyes. Then someone remembered. The realization settled over the room. Preston's scheme had never been about forcing a marriage alone. Whatever Alistair Whitmore had protected inside those woods was important enough to justify forged authority, intimidation, and years of deception. Outside, the rain finally gave way to pale morning light. Everett turned toward Clara. We leave now? If Evelyn still has the original records, we cannot afford another delay. They followed narrow woodland paths where towering pines filtered the sunlight into soft silver beams. Clara had wandered these trails countless times as a little girl, yet everything felt different now. Her father's lessons no longer sounded like simple stories. They felt like carefully planted warnings waiting for this exact moment. When Evelyn Mercer's small stone cottage appeared beyond the eastern grove, smoke curled gently from its chimney. The elderly woman opened the door before anyone knocked, relief softening her face as she embraced Clara. Her attention then shifted to Everett. She studied him for several quiet seconds, saying nothing, as though measuring a truth she could almost recognize but could not yet name. Come inside, she finally said. There isn't much time. The cottage carried the comforting scent of cedar and dried herbs. Evelyn disappeared into a back room before returning with an old wooden chest secured by an iron clasp. From inside, she lifted several linen-wrapped documents bearing the original Whitmore seal. Your father trusted me with these, she said. He feared someone would one day try to steal more than your inheritance. As Clara carefully unfolded the first parchment, Everett noticed a fresh cut across the back of his own hand, reopened during their hurried ride through the forest. A thin line of blood slipped across his knuckles. Without thinking, Clara reached into Naomi's satchel for clean linen and crushed comfort leaves. Hold still, she said instinctively. Everett looked at her with quiet surprise, but offered no resistance. Her fingers moved gently as she cleaned the wound, wrapping the cloth with practiced care. The moment her hand brushed his skin, an unfamiliar warmth traveled through him, subtle yet impossible to ignore. The constant vigilance that had accompanied him throughout his secret mission suddenly eased, replaced by a profound sense of peace he had not felt in years. For the briefest heartbeat, every instinct within the Alpha King recognized the woman standing before him. Clara noticed nothing beyond the slowing of his breathing. There, she said softly. It isn't much, but it should stop hurting. Everett lowered his eyes to the neatly tied bandage. He had faced countless battles without hesitation, yet this simple act of kindness unsettled him more deeply than any battlefield ever had. He understood exactly what that quiet certainty meant. She was his destined mate. But revealing the truth now would place her choice beneath the weight of his crown before she had learned who he truly was. He folded that realization into silence, protecting her freedom even from his own heart. Before anyone could speak again, hoofbeats shattered the stillness outside. Naomi hurried to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see armed riders surrounding the cottage from every direction. They're here, she whispered. Much sooner than expected. Everett instinctively stepped in front of Clara while Evelyn gathered the original documents against her chest. A heavy fist slammed against the front door. Then came Grant Holloway's unmistakable voice. Open this door, he called. By order of the Crown, every record inside now belongs to us. Everett glanced once at the bandage wrapped around his hand before lifting his eyes toward the entrance. Whatever happened next, he knew there was no turning back, not for the investigation, and no longer for his heart. The pounding against the cottage door grew heavier until dust drifted from the ceiling beams. Evelyn gathered the wrapped documents against her chest, as though protecting something far more precious than paper. Naomi quietly guided Clara behind the broad stone fireplace, but Clara refused to hide completely. Running had brought her this far. It would not save her forever. Everett remained by the entrance, his expression composed despite the growing voices outside. Grant expects panic, he said without looking away from the door. Let him find discipline instead. Another blow rattled the frame. Open it, Grant shouted. Anyone sheltering Clara Whitmore is now obstructing an official investigation. Everett finally lifted the iron latch. The door swung inward before Grant could strike it again. Cold air rushed into the room along with 6 armed men. Grant stepped across the threshold wearing the confidence of someone certain victory was already his. His gaze swept over the cottage until it settled on Clara. You continue making poor decisions, he said. First you invent a husband. Now you steal government records. Clara met his stare. They belonged to my father long before you ever claimed authority over them. Grant ignored her answer. Instead, he faced Everett. Your performance has lasted longer than expected. Walk away now, and I may decide you were merely deceived. Everett folded his hands behind his back. An innocent man rarely offers mercy before proving guilt. Grant's smile faded. Preston entered behind the guards, removing his gloves with careful precision. Unlike Grant, he carried no visible anger. His danger lived inside polished manners. Clara, he said almost gently, you've embarrassed this family enough. Hand over the papers, return home, and everything can still be resolved quietly. Evelyn stepped forward before Clara could respond. You forged your own brother's legacy, she declared. I watched him sign the originals with my own eyes. Preston's pleasant mask cracked for the first time. You're an aging servant clinging to fading memories. No, Evelyn answered firmly. I'm a witness. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the weight of that single word. Witnesses could unravel carefully built lies. Grant motioned toward the linen bundle. Take it. 2 guards advanced. Clara reacted before fear could stop her. She moved directly between Evelyn and the approaching men, spreading her arms without thinking about the consequences. If you want those records, she said, her voice trembling yet unwavering, you'll have to go through me. Grant laughed once. Gladly. He reached for her shoulder. Before his hand could touch her, Everett caught his wrist with effortless precision. The movement was swift enough that several guards instinctively stepped backward. Everett did not squeeze hard, yet Grant's expression tightened with unmistakable pain. She said no. Everett said quietly. That should have ended the conversation. For several heartbeats, neither man moved. The tension inside the cottage became almost unbearable. Then Everett released him and took one slow step back, refusing to escalate further. Grant rubbed his wrist, shocked less by the discomfort than by the realization that someone had stopped him so easily. Preston watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. You're no wandering merchant, he observed. Everett offered no explanation. The silence itself became an answer Preston could not interpret. Outside, another rider galloped into the clearing and whispered urgently into Grant's ear. Whatever he heard changed his calculations. Grant looked once more toward Clara, then toward the hidden bundle in Evelyn's arms. Keep your papers, he said coldly. Bring every one of them to the council tomorrow evening. There, before every alpha and every elder in Silverpine Ridge, we'll prove this marriage is fraudulent, expose every lie you've told, and strip Clara Whitmore of every legal claim she believes she still possesses. Preston adjusted his coat before following him outside. If you fail to appear, he added calmly, the council will declare you guilty in your absence. The riders disappeared into the forest, leaving only churned earth behind. No one inside the cottage spoke for several moments. Clara slowly realized what had just happened. There would be no escaping into another town, no hiding beneath another name, no quiet solution. Everything, her father's legacy, the truth about the forged authority, her future, and the fragile promise she had made with Everett inside a lonely inn, would now be decided before the entire council. Everett turned toward her at last. From this moment forward, he said, every step we take must be deliberate. Tomorrow isn't simply a hearing. His steady gaze held hers. It's the battlefield they chose, and we'll have to walk into it together. The ride back to the lantern's rest unfolded beneath a sky that had finally cleared, yet no one mistook the silence for peace. Grant's demand to appear before the council had transformed a desperate escape into a battle that could no longer be avoided. Upstairs, Evelyn carefully unwrapped the linen bundle once more, laying every preserved record across the table. Everett studied each seal with patient precision before separating one document from the rest. This, he said, turning it toward Clara, is the genuine royal authorization your father received. Clara leaned closer. The crowned wolf embossed in dark silver differed from the emblem carried by Grant's riders. Fine protective markings circled the edge, and beneath the wax rested the nearly invisible signature of the reigning crown. The copies they're using imitate the design, Everett explained, but not the craftsmanship. Anyone trained to inspect official decrees would recognize the forgery. Naomi frowned. Then why has no one questioned Preston? Evelyn answered quietly. Because almost no one has ever seen the original. He built his lies around other people's ignorance. Clara looked from one document to another, realizing how carefully her uncle had isolated her. Every conversation, every restriction, every warning had served the same purpose, to keep the truth out of reach until surrender seemed easier than resistance. Everett rolled the parchment closed. These records matter, he said, but paper alone won't win tomorrow. Clara looked up. Why? Because once the evidence weakens their position, they'll stop attacking the documents and start attacking you. The words landed with painful clarity. They'll say fear drove you to invent a marriage, manipulate witnesses, and accuse honorable men to protect yourself. Clara lowered her gaze. Part of that is true. The room fell silent. I did ask you to pretend to be my husband. Everett answered without hesitation. Yes. And tomorrow, we'll tell them exactly that. She stared at him, surprised. You still want the truth? Especially the truth, he replied. The lie was never your request. The lie was everything Preston built around it. Something inside Clara eased. For days she had feared that honesty would destroy the only chance she had left. Instead, Everett treated it as the strongest ground they could stand upon. Later that afternoon, while Naomi carefully prepared copies of Evelyn's records, Everett asked Clara to walk with him beyond the inn. They followed a ridge overlooking the silverwood, where the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of pine and cedar. My father used to bring me here, Clara said. He always told me the forest didn't belong to our family. We belonged to the forest. Everett smiled faintly. He understood stewardship better than ownership. After a thoughtful pause, he asked, Did he ever speak about your abilities? Clara shook her head. Only that I shouldn't measure my worth by becoming the kind of Omega everyone expected. I spent years believing I disappointed him because I never completed my wolf transformation. Everett studied the horizon. Perhaps the gift he hoped you'd protect was never strength in the way others defined it. Before Clara could ask what he meant, the distant sound of ceremonial horns echoed across the valley. Delegations from neighboring packs were already arriving for the council hearing. The moment they had tried to postpone was now racing toward them. As they returned to the inn, a lone rider approached from the northern road. He dismounted without drawing attention, nodded respectfully to Everett, and discreetly placed a folded message into his hand before disappearing as quickly as he had come. Clara noticed the exchange, but remained silent. Everett opened the note. For the first time since she had met him, the calm certainty in his face shifted. It was only the smallest change, a tightening of his jaw, a brief pause before folding the paper, but it was enough for Clara to understand that whatever he had just learned carried real weight. Is something wrong? She asked quietly. Everett slipped the message inside his coat and looked toward the road leading to Silverpine Ridge, where the last rays of daylight were fading. Tomorrow's hearing was never meant to expose only Preston and Grant, he said. My men have confirmed that the people behind the forged decrees are watching the council themselves. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Your men? Everett held her gaze for a long moment, realizing he had revealed more than intended. I've been waiting for someone I trust to arrive before I reveal the rest, he answered carefully. When the council begins, the game we've all been playing will finally end, and none of us will be able to hide behind borrowed names any longer. By late afternoon, every seat inside the council hall had been filled. Elders from neighboring packs occupied the stone benches while warriors lined the walls in complete silence. Clara entered beside Everett, Naomi, and Evelyn, aware that hundreds of eyes followed every step she took. Preston stood in formal black robes, wearing the calm dignity of a devoted guardian. Grant waited confidently near the center platform, convinced the hearing would end exactly as he had planned. The council master struck his staff against the floor. This hearing concerns the legality of Clara Whitmore's marriage, the inheritance of the Whitmore estate, and allegations involving forged royal authority. Preston spoke first. His polished voice carried practiced concern instead of anger. He portrayed Clara as a frightened young woman manipulated by strangers after rejecting a marriage arranged for her own protection. He praised Grant's patience, dismissed Evelyn's testimony as the confusion of old age, and described Naomi as a loyal friend blinded by emotion. Finally, his attention settled on Everett. "This man appeared only days ago," Preston declared. "He has no witnesses, no family, and no evidence that any lawful marriage ever took place." Quiet conversations spread through the chamber. The council master raised one hand toward Clara. "You may answer." Clara stepped into the open floor, her heartbeat echoing louder than the whispers surrounding her. "Everything began because I was afraid," she admitted. "I asked Everett to pretend to be my husband. That part is true." The room immediately stirred. Grant allowed himself a satisfied smile, believing she had destroyed her own defense. Clara lifted her head before anyone could interrupt. "But I asked because I refused to surrender my freedom, my father's legacy, and the right to choose my own future." Evelyn then presented the preserved records. One by one, authentic documents were placed before the council. Several elders leaned forward, carefully comparing the genuine royal seal with the counterfeit emblem recovered from Grant's men. Expressions of certainty slowly gave way to doubt. Preston immediately objected. "Parchments can be forged." "Not these," Evelyn answered without hesitation. "I received them directly from Alistair Whitmore before his death." Grant strode toward the center of the chamber, refusing to let control slip away. "Even if those records are genuine," he declared, pointing at Everett, "their marriage remains a deception." Silence followed. Everett neither argued nor looked away. "It began as an agreement to protect Clara for one night," he said calmly. Grant laughed. "Then you've confessed." Everett's gaze never left Clara. "The agreement ended the moment I chose to remain beside her by my own will." Grant's smile vanished. Anger replaced confidence. In one reckless motion, he grabbed Clara's arm. "Enough," he barked. "An unmated Omega doesn't decide her own future." Clara pulled against his grip, but before anyone could move, the entire chamber trembled beneath an overwhelming surge of alpha authority. Flames shivered inside every lantern. Warriors instinctively dropped to one knee. Grant released Clara as though burned, stumbling backward with disbelief written across his face. He looked from Everett to the elders, waiting for someone to deny what he had just felt. No one did. "Impossible," Grant whispered, taking another unsteady step back. His eyes searched Everett's face, then the plain silver band still resting on his hand. "You're no." Everett answered only with action. He slowly removed the simple ring that had concealed both his scent and his rank since arriving in Silverpine Ridge. The invisible restraint disappeared at once. An unmistakable royal alpha presence swept through the hall with quiet, undeniable authority. Gasps echoed from every corner. Several elders lowered their heads in immediate recognition. At that exact moment, the great doors opened again. Royal guards entered in flawless formation, their armor bearing the true crest of the crown. At their head walked Miles Calloway, who stopped before Everett and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty," Miles announced, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. "The remaining conspirators have been arrested. The investigation confirms forged royal decrees, unlawful seizure of crown-protected land, and conspiracy against the throne." Preston's composure finally shattered. Grant stared at the royal insignia, then back at Everett, desperately trying to reconcile the quiet traveler from the roadside inn with the ruler standing before him. "No," he murmured again. "This can't be happening." Everett stepped protectively in front of Clara, not as a conqueror, but as the man who had accepted the hand of a frightened woman on a storm-filled night. He looked across the council before speaking. "This hearing is no longer about whether Clara Whitmore deserves protection," he said. "It is about whether justice still has a place in this kingdom." The chamber remained utterly still until Grant, driven by the last fragments of pride he possessed, lifted his head one final time. "Even if you're the Alpha King," he challenged hoarsely, "you still cannot claim an Omega who isn't your destined mate." The chamber remained motionless after Grant's challenge. No one dared speak while the Alpha King's presence filled the hall. Everett neither reached for Clara nor answered in anger. Instead, he took one measured step back, leaving enough space between them for everyone to see that she stood by her own choice. His restraint unsettled the room far more than any display of power could have. "You're right about one thing," Everett said to Grant. "No king has the right to claim a woman against her will." Clara turned toward him, surprised by the quiet certainty in his voice. He could have ended every argument with authority alone, yet he refused to let rank decide her future. Miles stepped forward and presented several sealed packets to the council master. "Recovered this morning," he announced. "Correspondence between Preston Whitmore and Grant Holloway, forged crown decrees, and payment records connected to the unlawful transfer of protected Silverwood lands." Elder after elder examined the evidence. Faces that had once reflected doubt slowly hardened with disappointment. Preston attempted to speak, but the council master silenced him with a raised hand. "You will answer after the documents are reviewed." Evelyn approached, carrying the final item she had guarded for years, Alistair Whitmore's original testament. She unfolded it with careful hands and placed it before the elders. The familiar seal matched the authentic royal authorization exactly. "My brother entrusted his daughter with stewardship," Preston muttered, desperation replacing confidence. "She cannot manage those lands." "That was never your decision," Evelyn replied. Clara watched the exchange without triumph. She simply felt years of confusion settling into place. The whispered accusations, the constant supervision, the endless insistence that she was incapable. All of it had been built to make her surrender something she never realized she possessed. Grant refused to yield. "Even if every paper is genuine," he snapped, "she remains an incomplete Omega. She cannot stand beside a ruler." His words echoed through the chamber before fading into silence. Clara slowly lifted her chin. "You're correct that I never became what others expected," she answered. "But everything I protected without strength, status, or certainty that anyone would stand beside me. If that still isn't enough for you, nothing ever will be." No one applauded. No one interrupted. The stillness itself became acknowledgement. Everett looked at her with unmistakable respect, not because she needed rescuing, but because she had chosen courage when fear would have been easier. The council master rose. "Preston Whitmore is removed as legal guardian of the Whitmore estate pending final judgment. Grant Holloway is stripped of temporary authority and will remain under royal custody until sentencing." Royal guards stepped forward. Preston's shoulders sagged for the first time, while Grant struggled against the soldiers before realizing resistance was useless. As they were escorted away, Grant glanced back toward Clara, but she no longer lowered her eyes. She met his stare calmly until he disappeared beyond the great doors. Gradually, the spectators began leaving the hall, their conversations no longer centered on scandal, but on justice delayed for too many years. Several younger Omegas quietly stepped aside to let Clara pass first, while older pack members lowered their heads in silent respect. Naomi watched the moment with tears gathering in her eyes, understanding that the victory belonged not only to her friend, but to every woman who had once believed her voice would never matter. When the chamber had nearly emptied, Everett approached without urgency and stopped a respectful distance away. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara blinked in surprise. "For what?" "When you asked me to pretend to be your husband, I accepted because I believed it would help my investigation. Somewhere along the way, protecting you stopped being part of the mission." His eyes never left hers. "It simply became the only place my heart wanted to be." Clara searched his face, finding no trace of the guarded traveler she had first met at the inn. Only honesty remained. "And now?" she asked softly. Everett's gaze warmed. "Now I don't want a single decision between us to come from obligation, gratitude, or my title." He extended his hand, not to lead her, but simply to offer it. After one quiet heartbeat, Clara placed her fingers in his. Neither spoke as they walked together through the great doors into the evening light, where the silverwood forest shimmered beneath the setting sun. Ahead waited the land her father had protected, the future she had nearly lost, and one final choice that no council, no king, and no ancient law could ever make in her place. Morning light spread across the silverwood like a quiet blessing. For the first time in years, Clara walked beneath its ancient branches without fear of footsteps following behind her. Workers had already begun removing the barriers Preston ordered built around the oldest groves, while families from neighboring packs arrived carrying saplings instead of weapons. The forest no longer belonged to those who wished to possess it. It had returned to those willing to protect it. Several days after the council hearing, the final judgment was delivered. Preston Whitmore lost every claim he had stolen through forged authority and deceit. Grant Holloway was stripped of his title and sentenced for coercion, unlawful seizure of protected land, and conspiring against the crown. The counterfeit decrees that had frightened so many communities were publicly destroyed, ensuring no one could invoke false royal power again. Evelyn Mercer accepted responsibility for restoring the Whitmore estate until Clara was ready to assume its stewardship. Naomi chose to remain beside her friend, organizing shelters throughout the valley where abandoned Omegas could find safety, education, and honest work. It became the future Clara's father had quietly imagined, though he had never lived to see it. Only one question remained unanswered. Late that afternoon, Everett asked Clara to meet him beside the oldest cedar overlooking the heart of the silverwood. There were no guards surrounding him, no royal banners, and no council waiting to witness another declaration. He had deliberately come alone. Clara smiled as she approached. "You dismissed your escort." Everett returned the smile. "Today I wanted no one speaking for me." For a few moments, they simply listened to the breeze moving through the branches above them. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. "When I asked you to pretend to be my husband, I believed I was borrowing one night of safety." Everett looked toward the path where they had first entered the forest together. "And I believed I was accepting a temporary role to finish an investigation." He drew a slow breath before meeting her eyes again. "Both of us were wrong." Clara laughed softly, remembering the frightened woman who had stood inside the lantern's rest with trembling hands and nowhere else to turn. "You could have revealed who you were that first night." "I could have," Everett admitted. "But then you might have trusted the crown instead of the man." His answer settled gently between them. Every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every moment of uncertainty suddenly carried a different meaning. He had never asked her to love a king. He had wanted to know whether she could believe in Everett Blackwell before she ever learned who he truly was. He stepped closer but stopped within arm's reach, leaving the final distance for her to decide. In the council hall, he said quietly, "I defended your freedom before I spoke of my heart, because your choice mattered more than my hope. That promise hasn't changed." Clara studied him for a long moment before reaching into the pocket of her cloak. She withdrew her mother's silver hairpin, the one possession she had carried from the estate on the night everything began. Carefully, she fastened it into her hair, then closed the final step between them. "The frightened woman who asked for one night is gone," she whispered. "The woman standing here has a choice." She placed her hand in his. "And I choose you." Emotion softened Everett's features as the quiet bond they had both resisted finally settled between them without fear, pressure, or expectation. He lifted her hand gently and kissed her knuckles. "Then let everyone hear the truth this time," he said. When they returned to the village together, the people waiting outside the restored Whitmore home fell silent. Everett did not raise his voice, yet every word carried across the gathering. "Clara Whitmore is not protected because she belongs to a king." He looked at her with unmistakable devotion before finishing the sentence that destiny had been leading toward from the beginning. "She is my Luna." For one breathless moment, silence embraced the entire valley. Then the oldest alpha present slowly bowed his head. One by one, every other alpha followed. Beside them, Omegas who had spent years lowering their eyes now stood a little straighter. Some smiled through tears. Others quietly reached for the hands of their children, as though hoping they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Naomi wiped away a tear before laughing softly, while Evelyn closed her eyes with peaceful gratitude, knowing Alistair Whitmore's greatest wish had finally been fulfilled. Clara looked across the people surrounding her and realized they were not celebrating the rise of a queen. They were celebrating the triumph of a woman who had been given the freedom to choose her own life. She turned back to Everett, whose eyes held nothing but quiet love, never possession. Together they walked beneath the silverwood her father had protected, toward a future neither power nor destiny alone could have created. The promise that had begun with a desperate plea inside a lonely roadside and had found its rightful ending. Not because a frightened Omega asked a stranger to pretend for one night, but because two hearts chose one another freely, and in doing so, reminded an entire kingdom that true strength is gentle and love redeems.